The glass conservatory glowed like something out of a dream I could never afford to have, and I moved through it the way I moved through every rich stranger's happiest night. Quietly, quickly, with a camera between me and the world so no one would notice how out of place I looked in my one good black dress. Champagne towers caught the candlelight and threw it back in gold ribbons across the marble floor. White roses filled every surface, thousands of them, so many that the air itself smelled expensive. I lifted my camera and let the shutter do what my voice never could at these events, which was speak. Click! A crystal flute lifted in a toast, condensation sliding down glass like a slow tear. Click! A string quartet bent over their instruments, silver hair and black tuxedos, playing something that sounded like money learning to feel. Click! The bride. Elodie Arden stood at the center of the room in a dress that cost more than I'd make in 2 years. Her dark hair swept up, her smile arranged so perfectly that I almost believed it. Almost. I'd photographed enough weddings to know the difference between a woman glowing with love and a woman performing it for an audience that was paying very close attention. Elodie's smile reached her mouth and stopped there, never climbing higher, never touching her eyes, which kept drifting toward the door like she was waiting for an exit that wasn't going to come. Beside her, Julian Crest kept one hand at the small of her back, not affectionate so much as anchoring, the way you'd keep a hand on something you didn't trust to stay put on its own. He was handsome in the way expensive things are handsome, symmetrical and cold, and every time someone complimented Elodie, he answered for her, smooth and quick, like her voice was a formality he didn't need to wait for. I kept shooting. That was my job. Not to judge, not to interfere. Just to see, and to capture, and to leave with an envelope of cash that would keep my studio's lights on for another month. I told myself that while I photographed a woman near the champagne fountain adjusting her jaw before she smiled at someone, while I photographed an older woman in navy silk watching the room like she owned every soul in it, that would be Margot Ardan, the mother of the bride. I'd find out later. Though right now she was simply the coldest pair of eyes I'd ever aimed a lens at. And then I felt it, that particular prickle at the back of my neck that told me, before my mind caught up, that I was being watched. I lowered the camera slowly, the way you do when you don't want to spook whatever you've sensed, and I found her across the room. She was standing near the far wall, half in shadow, half lit gold by a chandelier, dressed in black silk that didn't shimmer so much as absorb the light around her. And she was not looking at the bride. She was not looking at the room, or the roses, or the string quartet, or anything a normal person at an engagement party might be looking at. She was looking at me. Not glancing, looking. The kind of look that has weight, that lands somewhere under your sternum and stays there. Her eyes were dark and very still, and there was nothing curious or idle in them. There was something deliberate, something that made my pulse trip even though I didn't yet have a name to put to the feeling. I told myself I'd imagined the intensity of it. People glanced at photographers all the time, a reflexive check of who's capturing them, nothing more. I lifted the camera again, half out of instinct, half because I needed something to hide behind, and through the viewfinder, I found her still there, still watching, and this time she didn't look away when the shutter clicked. She let me take the photograph. She let me see her. I lowered the camera again, my hands not quite steady, and someone announced that it was time for the toasts, and the room turned like a tide toward the happy couple, and when I looked back to the shadowed wall, she was gone. I didn't get her name until later, from Ren, my studio assistant, best friend, and the only person besides me who knew exactly how close Mercer Photography was to closing its doors for good. Ren had come along to help carry equipment and had spent the last hour charming the catering staff into extra hors d'oeuvres. "That's Seraphine Arden," Ren murmured beside me, following my gaze even though Seraphine had already vanished. "The aunt. She runs the family's art foundation. People say she hasn't smiled in a photograph in a decade. Some board member tried to make small talk with her at a gala last year, and apparently she just stared at him until he stopped talking. Legendary. Terrifying. Do not, under any circumstances, make eye contact." "Too late," I said, and Ren laughed, not knowing how true it was. Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. The rest of the evening passed in the blur that all these events eventually became for me. Candid shots of laughing guests, posed shots of the happy couple that felt anything but happy up close, a photograph of Margot Arden's hand closing over her daughter's wrist, just a fraction too tight, when Elodie tried to step away from a conversation. I almost didn't take that last one. Something in me hesitated, camera halfway raised, some old instinct that told me I was about to see something I wasn't supposed to see. But the photographer in me, the part that couldn't stop chasing truth even when it would have been easier not to, pressed the shutter anyway. I didn't think about that photograph again until 3 days later, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize and a voice I did. "Miss Mercer," Seraphine Arden said, and her voice was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like it at all. Low, precise, unhurried, with an edge underneath the calm that made the hair on my arms rise. "I'd like to see you at the Arden Foundation Gallery. This afternoon, if your schedule permits." "My schedule permits," I said, because my schedule always permitted anything that might pay rent. "Good. Bring your laptop. And Miss Mercer, bring the raw files from Saturday night. All of them." She hung up before I could ask why, which I would come to learn was very much her way. The Arden Foundation Gallery occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in the Arts District. All exposed brick and soaring windows. The kind of space that made my cluttered studio with its second-hand couch and unpaid electric bill feel like a different planet entirely. Seraphine was waiting when I arrived, standing in front of a wall of black and white photographs that weren't hers, arms crossed, dressed today in a charcoal suit that fit her like it had been sewn onto her body that morning. "You're precise with time," she said, by way of greeting. "I appreciate that. Most people in your industry are not. Most people in my industry aren't terrified of missing a rent payment," I said, before I could stop myself, and something flickered at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a small table near the window, and when I sat, she sat across from me, and I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder of images from Saturday night, and I watched her watch them. She went through them slowly, methodically, her expression giving away nothing, until she reached the photograph of Margot's hand on Elodie's wrist. Her whole body went still, in a way that was somehow louder than any reaction could have been. "This one," she said quietly. "I need you to understand something, Miss Mercer. This image cannot be released. Not to the family's publicist, not to any wedding album, not anywhere." "I wasn't planning on selling candid shots of family drama to a tabloid," I said. "I photograph weddings, not scandals." "That's not what I asked." Her eyes lifted to mine, sharp now, testing. "I asked you to delete it." I felt something in me straighten, some old stubbornness that had gotten me through every landlord's threat and every client who thought paying meant owning. "I don't delete truth because it's inconvenient for someone," I said. "That photograph isn't going anywhere it shouldn't go, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw." I expected anger. I expected the legendary coldness Wren had warned me about, the stare that had silenced a board member into humiliation. Instead, Seraphine Arden looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then she said, very quietly, "No, I don't suppose you would." She closed the laptop herself, gently, and folded her hands on top of it. "I have a different proposition. The foundation needs a photographer for a series of portraits. Patrons, board members, myself. Unfortunately, since apparently a foundation cannot exist without a face attached to it. My previous photographer retired. I'd like you to take his place. It pays considerably more than wedding photography, and considerably less patience is required for the champagne fountains." I should have said yes immediately. My studio's rent was 3 weeks from being late again. Instead, I said, "Why me? You could hire anyone. You could hire someone with an actual reputation." "I could," she agreed. "But you looked at that photograph and told me the truth instead of what I wanted to hear. That's rarer than talent, Miss Mercer. In my experience, it's rarer than almost anything." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I told myself it was the money. And it was. Partly. But even then, walking back out into the afternoon light with a contract in my bag and her card in my pocket, I knew it wasn't only that. The first portrait session happened a week later, in a private room at the back of the gallery with north-facing windows and a single high-backed chair positioned in a pool of natural light. Seraphine arrived precisely on time, dressed in deep green silk, and sat in the chair like a queen sitting for a coronation portrait. Spine straight, chin level, an expression arranged into something composed and utterly unreachable. I photographed that expression for 20 minutes and hated every frame. "You're posing," I said finally, lowering the camera. "I'm sitting for a portrait. That is, generally, what one does." "You're performing for a portrait. There's a difference." I came around the tripod and crouched slightly so I was closer to her eye level. I've photographed hundreds of people who thought they knew what a camera wanted from them. Every single one of them gave me a mask. "I don't want your mask, Miss Arden. I have 100 photographs of your mask already, in every society page from the last decade." Something flashed in her eyes. Irritation, maybe, or something closer to being caught. "And what exactly do you imagine is underneath it?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "That's the whole point." For a moment, I thought I'd overstepped badly enough to lose the job before I'd properly started it. Then she exhaled, slow and controlled, and something in her shoulders dropped half an inch, and I lifted the camera and caught it. The smallest, unguarded breath, the briefest flicker of a woman who was tired of holding herself so carefully together. It wasn't a smile, it wasn't even close, but it was real, and I knew the moment I saw it through the viewfinder that I'd finally photographed something true. "Show me," she said afterward, when I'd finished, and I turned the camera's screen toward her, scrolling to that one frame among the dozens I'd taken. She went quiet, looking at the image of herself for a long time. "I don't look like that," she said finally, but there was no certainty in it, only something closer to confusion, like she was seeing a stranger who happened to share her face. "You do," I said. "You just don't usually let anyone see it." She looked up at me then, and the silence between us stretched long enough that I became aware of my own pulse, aware of the light falling across her face, aware that I'd been standing closer to her than professional distance really allowed. "No," she agreed softly, "I don't." The sessions continued through the following weeks, 1 or 2 afternoons at a time, and each one chipped away at something between us that I didn't have a word for yet, though I recognized its shape. She started arriving without the full armor of her public persona. No perfectly tailored blazer some days, just a soft sweater and dark trousers, her hair looser, her guard lower by degrees, so small I might have missed them if I hadn't been trained to notice exactly this kind of thing. She started talking too, in fragments at first. A dry comment about board meetings, a mention of a mother who died when Seraphine was 22, leaving her the unofficial keeper of a family that had never quite recovered from losing its center. She never said much at once, but she said more to me, I began to suspect, than she said to anyone else. I learned that Seraphine had built the Arden Foundation herself, from nothing, while her sister Margot married strategically and raised Elodie to understand that love was a currency best spent on alliances rather than feelings. I learned that Seraphine had spent 15 years cleaning up her family's messes, a scandal here, a bad investment there, a nephew's gambling debts, a cousin's affair, quietly, efficiently, at the cost of any life of her own. I learned, though she never said it outright, that somewhere in those 15 years, she had stopped believing she was allowed to want anything for herself. I didn't tell her, not yet, that I recognized the shape of that particular loneliness, because I lived inside a version of it too, the woman who was always behind the lens, always capturing other people's happiness, never quite believing she deserved to be inside the frame herself. It was Elodie who first noticed something was different. On an afternoon I'd been called to the family's townhouse to photograph engagement announcement portraits that Margot insisted on for the society pages. Elodie found me in the garden while I was packing up equipment, her expression uncharacteristically unguarded. "You're good for her," she said, without preamble. "For who?" "You know for who." Elodie sat on the edge of a stone bench, twisting her engagement ring around her finger, in a way that looked less like affection and more like a nervous tic. "My aunt hasn't laughed in front of me in years. I heard her laugh last week," After your session. I didn't even recognize the sound. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and Elodie looked at me with something that might have been envy, or might have been longing for something else entirely. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "I don't want this wedding." The words hung in the garden air between us, quiet and enormous. "Then don't have it," I said, because it seemed like the obvious answer, though I already understood, from 3 weeks of photographing this family, that nothing about their lives was obvious. It's not that simple. Julian's family and mine, there's money involved, old debts, old promises. My mother has spent my whole life building toward this. If I walk away, I don't just disappoint her. I destroy something she's spent decades constructing. Elodie looked down at her ring. "I used to think love would just happen to me eventually, like weather. I didn't realize you were supposed to go looking for it." "You are," I said softly. "You're allowed to go looking for it." She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Not romantic interest, I understood immediately, but something like recognition, one trapped person seeing another. "You should be careful," she said finally, "with my aunt. Not because she'd hurt you, because my mother would." I thought about that warning more than I wanted to, driving home that evening, the city lights blurring past my windshield. I thought about it while I edited photographs late into the night in my cramped studio, walls covered floor to ceiling with other people's weddings, other people's happiness, framed and matted and hung like a gallery of lives I'd only ever visited and never lived. I thought about Seraphine Arden's rare, unguarded breath caught on camera, and I thought about how badly I wanted to see it again. The rain started the following Thursday, the kind of hard, sudden storm the city produced without warning, and I was still at the gallery long after the session had ended, waiting it out under the awning with my equipment bags at my feet, watching water sheet down over the street in silver curtains. I heard the door open behind me before I heard her voice. "You should have called a car," Seraphine said, coming to stand beside me under the narrow awning, close enough that I could smell her perfume beneath the whetstone smell of the storm. Something dark and floral, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. I was going to walk to the train. It's 4 blocks, as if to argue with me. Thunder rolled somewhere close, and the rain intensified. "Absolutely not," she said, in a tone that brooked no negotiation, and within a minute, a sleek black car pulled up at the curb, her driver stepping out with an umbrella before I'd even seen her make a call. "Get in, Miss Mercer. I won't have my photographer catching pneumonia over 4 blocks of misplaced pride." I got in. It seemed easier than arguing, and some quieter part of me didn't want to argue at all. She got in after me, which I hadn't expected, sliding into the seat beside me instead of sending me off alone, and the car pulled away from the curb into the storm, rain streaking gold and red across the windows from the streetlights and taillights outside. The interior smelled like leather, and her perfume, warm and close, and neither of us said anything for several blocks, the silence comfortable in a way silences with her rarely were. "Thank you," I said eventually, "for the ride." "You looked cold," she said, which wasn't really an answer, and then, after a pause, "I don't often do this. Ride with someone. My assistant usually handles logistics, like ensuring my employees don't drown in the street. Am I your employee then, officially?" "You're something," she said, and there was an edge of humor under the words, dry and unexpected. "I haven't decided what yet." I looked over at her in the passing light, her profile lit gold and shadow by turns, and something in my chest tightened, warm and dangerous. "You could just say photographer," I offered. "It's simpler." "Simple has never been particularly useful to me," she said, and turned to look at me directly, and the car's interior felt suddenly very small, very warm, the rain outside a soft roar against the glass. Her eyes moved over my face in a way that wasn't professional at all, wasn't the careful assessment of an employer, but something slower, something that made my pulse climb into my throat. "You unsettle me, Miss Mercer." "I don't mean to." "I know." "That's precisely the problem." She looked away first, back toward the window, though I could see her jaw tighten, could see the effort it took her to put the careful distance back between us. "I built a very particular life, controlled, predictable, safe for everyone I'm responsible for. And then you walked into an engagement party with a camera and photographed the one thing everyone else in that room had agreed not to see. I didn't mean to unsettle anything, I said quietly. I just photographed what was there. I know, she said again, softer this time. That's what unsettles me. The car pulled up outside my building before either of us said anything else, the moment folding itself closed the way these moments always did between us, careful and unfinished. And she walked me to the door beneath the driver's umbrella, close enough that our shoulders brushed, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off her despite the cold rain. "Good night, Calla," she said, and it was the first time she'd used my first name, and it landed in my chest like something breaking open. "Good night, Seraphine," I said, testing the sound of her name in my mouth, and she went very still for a moment, watching me, before she nodded once and turned back toward the car, leaving me standing in my doorway with my heart pounding harder than 4 blocks of walking ever could have made it. The dinner invitation came 2 weeks later, folded into a formal note on Arden Foundation letterhead that felt almost comically official for what it actually was, an invitation to her townhouse, ostensibly to review final selections for the portrait series, though we both knew by then that our sessions had stopped being purely professional the day she'd learned my first name. Her townhouse was nothing like I expected. Not cold, not museum perfect, but warm, in a way that surprised me, filled with books stacked in careful towers, art that looked chosen rather than acquired, low lighting that made the space feel like a sanctuary rather than a showcase. She'd cooked, which surprised me even more, something simple and fragrant, and we ate at a small table near tall windows overlooking the city, and for the first time since I'd met her, she talked without careful editing, about her mother's death, about the foundation, about a woman she'd loved once, years ago, before her family's expectations had made loving anyone feel like a liability. "What happened?" I asked, and she was quiet for a long moment, turning her wine glass slowly by its stem. She wanted a life, a real one, with dinners like this every night, not stolen ones between board meetings and scandal management. I told her I couldn't give her that. I was building the foundation, holding my family together, and I told myself there wasn't room for anything else. She looked up at me, something raw in her eyes that I'd never seen there before. She left. I told myself I didn't have room for that kind of grief either, so I simply didn't feel it, for a very long time. And now? Now, she said softly, I find myself making room for things I promised I never would again. I didn't move, didn't breathe, watching her across the candlelight, and she reached across the small table and covered my hand with hers, her fingers warm and careful, like she was afraid I might disappear if she moved too fast. I've spent my whole career being the person who sees things nobody else notices, I said quietly. I never thought I'd be one of them. The things people notice, I mean. You are, she said. Impossible not to notice, actually. I've tried. I laughed, surprised into it, and she smiled. Really smiled. The smile I'd been chasing through a camera lens for weeks, unguarded and soft and entirely hers. And something in me came undone. May I kiss you? She asked, low and careful. And I nodded before she'd even finished the question. And she leaned across the small space between us and kissed me slowly, like she had all the time in the world, like she'd been waiting years to do exactly this. Her hand came up to cradle my jaw, her thumb tracing along my cheekbone, and I felt something in me that had been tightly wound for years finally begin to loosen. When we finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both of us breathing unsteadily, she laughed softly against my mouth, a sound I'd never heard from her before, something young and almost disbelieving. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I haven't let myself want anything in a very long time. Neither have I said. But I want this. I want you. We didn't rush the rest of the evening. She showed me her library, her favorite paintings, the small collection of photographs she kept hidden behind a bookshelf, images of her mother, of the woman she'd loved and lost, of a version of herself from decades ago that still had room for softness in her face. Later, when the night grew late and the rain returned, gentle this time, tapping against the windows, she asked me to stay, and I did. and what passed between us afterward was slow and tender and unspoken, the kind of intimacy that needed no audience and no explanation, only two women finally choosing to be seen by someone who wanted nothing from them but the truth. I woke before dawn in her enormous bed, sunlight just beginning to gray the curtains, her arm draped over my waist, her breathing slow and even against my shoulder. I lay there for a long time, memorizing the weight of her arm, the warmth of her body, the impossible fact of being wanted rather than simply useful, and I thought, with something like wonder, that I had never once believed love could look like this. Quiet, unhurried, entirely undramatic, entirely real. It couldn't last that way, of course. Nothing that good ever seemed to. Not in a family like the Ardens, where every private moment eventually became a public liability. 2 weeks after that first night in her townhouse, Seraphine surprised me by asking to see my studio. The real one, not the polished gallery space where I'd conducted her portrait sessions, but the cramped, cluttered room above a dry cleaner's where I actually worked and lived and struggled to make ends meet. I nearly said no. I'd spent so many years being careful about who saw the unglamorous truth of my life. The mismatched furniture, the stack of unpaid invoices weighted down by an old lens cap, the water stain on the ceiling I'd never had the money to fix, that the idea of Seraphine Arden standing in the middle of it made my stomach twist with something like shame. But she asked again the following week, gently, without pressure, and something in the asking itself, the patience of it, made me finally say yes. She arrived on a Tuesday evening in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking so unlike the composed woman from the gallery that I almost didn't recognize her silhouette in my doorway. She stepped inside slowly, taking in the walls covered floor to ceiling with photographs, brides laughing until they cried, grooms weeping openly at altars, grandmothers dancing barefoot at receptions long after their shoes had become unbearable, all the raw, unposed truth I'd spent years collecting from other people's happiest days. "This is extraordinary," she said, turning in a slow circle, and I heard no performance in it, no polite compliment offered out of obligation. "It's a mess," I said. "The ceiling leaks. My equipment is 10 years old. Half these frames are second-hand." "It's alive," she said simply, running her fingers along the edge of one frame, a photograph of an elderly couple at their 50th anniversary, foreheads pressed together, eyes closed. "My house looks like a magazine spread. Yours looks like a life." I made tea and mismatched mugs because I didn't own a matching set, and we sat on my old couch with our knees almost touching, and she asked to see the photographs I hadn't hung, the ones tucked in boxes and portfolios because they were too personal, too unfinished, too honest even for my own walls. I showed her anyway. I showed her photographs of my mother before she passed, of Wren laughing so hard she'd nearly fallen off a chair, of myself at 22, thin and hopeful, and utterly unprepared for how hard this career would be. "You let people see everything except yourself," Seraphine observed quietly, studying the photograph of me at 22. "That's rather the opposite of what I do, and yet somehow we've ended up in the exact same place." "Hiding?" I said. Hiding," she agreed, and reached over to take my hand, lacing her fingers through mine on the worn cushion between us, and we sat like that for a long while, not speaking, simply existing together, in a small, imperfect room that had never once felt like enough until she was sitting inside it. The family estate visit came a week after that, an obligation neither of us could avoid. Margot had insisted on a formal photography session for the extended family, an annual tradition she refused to abandon regardless of who took the pictures, and Seraphine had quietly ensured the job stayed with me despite her sister's obvious preference for someone with a longer, safer resume. The Arden estate sat an hour outside the city, a sprawling stone manor surrounded by manicured gardens that made my studio look, by comparison, like a shoebox wedged between two larger buildings. I felt every inch of my modest upbringing the moment I stepped out of my second-hand car onto gravel raked into perfect lines, and Seraphine, sensing it, appeared at my side before I'd even reached the front steps. "You look like you're bracing for battle," she murmured, low enough that only I could hear. "I feel like I've wandered into the wrong movie," I admitted. I grew up in a two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. This place has its own hedge maze. The hedge maze is absurd, she agreed. My grandfather built it to impress a business partner in the 60s. Nobody has used it for anything except losing small children at family gatherings since. She glanced sideways at me, something softening in her expression. You belong here as much as anyone standing on this gravel, Calla. More, honestly. Most of them inherited their place. You earned yours. The photography session itself passed without incident. Generations of Ardens arranged on the manor's front steps in careful formation. Though I made a point, as always, of capturing the moments between the poses too. A young cousin sticking out her tongue at an older relative. An uncle adjusting his tie with visible irritation. Elodie's genuine laugh when a family dog bounded unexpectedly into frame. Margot watched my process with thinly veiled suspicion throughout, as though waiting for me to make some catastrophic mistake that would justify her doubts. But even she couldn't argue with the final images, elegant and warm in equal measure. It was afterward, wandering the gardens while equipment was packed away, that Seraphine pulled me gently behind a tall hedge, out of view from the house, and kissed me slowly, thoroughly, her hands framing my face like she was trying to memorize the shape of it. I've wanted to do that since you stepped out of your car, she admitted against my mouth. In front of your entire extended family's estate? Especially there, she said, something fierce and a little reckless in her voice that I hadn't heard from her before. I spent my whole childhood learning that this place required perfect composure. I find I very much enjoy breaking that particular rule with you. We stayed hidden behind the hedge a while longer than strictly necessary, laughing quietly like teenagers sneaking away from a chaperoned dance, and when we finally emerged, flushed and smiling, Margot's sharp eyes found us instantly from the terrace, her expression tightening into something disapproving that neither of us, in that golden, stolen moment, cared enough to notice. The photograph appeared 3 weeks later, splashed across a gossip site with a headline dripping with insinuation, the Arden Foundation's icy director, caught in an intimate embrace with a mysterious younger woman outside her own townhouse, taken from an angle that made an innocent goodbye kiss look like something calculated, transactional, scandalous. Someone had been watching, someone had been waiting. Margot called an emergency meeting within hours, and I was summoned to it, though summoned felt like too polite a word for the icy, formal request that arrived through Seraphine's assistant. I arrived at the Arden estate to find the family assembled in a drawing room that felt more like a courtroom. Margot at its head, Julian standing near the window with his arms crossed, and something like satisfaction curling at the edge of his mouth. Elodie sitting rigid and silent near the fireplace, and Seraphine standing apart from all of them, her face arranged back into the mask I'd spent weeks learning to see past. "Explain yourself," Margot said, the moment I walked in. Not a greeting, simply an order. "Explain what, exactly?" I asked, though I already understood, my stomach tight with dread. "You were hired to photograph this family's happiest moments. Instead, you've made yourself the subject of its most humiliating headline in a decade." Margot's voice was ice, precise and cutting. "Did you plan this? Seduce my sister for access to this family's money, its name, its influence? You wouldn't be the first opportunist to try." "That's absurd," I said, my voice shaking with anger I fought to control. "I didn't seduce anyone. I fell in love with someone who happened to be your sister. That's not a scheme. That's just what happened." "Love," Julian said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. "How convenient. That love happened to land you inside one of the wealthiest families in the city." "Julian," Elodie said sharply, the first time I'd heard her raise her voice to him, but he ignored her entirely, his attention fixed on me with something like contempt. "I think it would be best," Margot said, cutting through the room like a blade, "if Miss Mercer's services were no longer required, and if this entire embarrassing episode were quietly forgotten. Seraphine, I trust you'll handle the necessary distancing." I looked at Seraphine then, waiting, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, waiting for her to say something, anything, to defend what we'd built between us in careful, quiet pieces over the past 2 months. Instead, she was silent, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, and the silence stretched long enough to answer the question I hadn't dared ask aloud. "Seraphine," I said, softer now, just for her, though the whole room could hear it. "I think," she said finally, her voice carefully even, carefully controlled, "that it would be best if we ended the professional arrangement, and anything else." The words landed like a physical blow, and I felt my face go hot with humiliation, standing in that room full of people who'd already decided I was a mistake to be corrected. "Fine," I said, my voice breaking despite every effort to keep it steady. "I understand." I didn't understand. I understood nothing except that I needed to leave that room before I fell apart in front of people who would have enjoyed watching it happen, and so I left, walking out through the enormous front doors into a gray afternoon, and I didn't look back to see if Seraphine watched me go. I spent the following week in a fog, moving through my studio like a ghost, editing wedding photographs of other people's happiness, while my own had apparently been a temporary indulgence for a woman who chose her family's reputation the moment it actually cost her something. Ren tried everything to pull me out of it. Bad movies, worse takeout, long rants about how the Ardens could all fall into the ocean, but nothing quite touched the particular ache of having been seen, truly seen, by someone, and then watching her decide that seeing me wasn't worth the price. It was Elodie who came to my studio, unannounced, on a rainy afternoon, 9 days after the drawing room confrontation, standing in my doorway looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, without the practiced polish of a society daughter, just a young woman who looked exhausted by the weight of everyone else's expectations. "She didn't mean it," Elodie said, without preamble, echoing her own words from weeks earlier. My aunt. What she said in that room. "She meant it enough to say it," I said, not bothering to hide the rawness in my voice. "She's been miserable since. Genuinely miserable. My mother thinks she's simply behaving appropriately, keeping up appearances, but I've known my aunt my whole life, and I've never seen her like this." Elodie sat down on my worn couch, looking around at the walls covered in other people's love stories. "She thought she was protecting you. That's what she does. She absorbs everyone else's damage, so the rest of us don't have to feel it. She's been doing it since her mother died. She doesn't know how to do anything else. Protecting me by breaking my heart in front of your entire family? I didn't say it made sense," Elodie said quietly. "I said it's what she does. Old habits, Calla. 15 years of putting everyone else's safety above her own happiness. You didn't just ask her to love you. You asked her to believe she was allowed to." I sat down across from her, something in my chest loosening slightly, despite my anger, despite the hurt still raw and open. "I can't keep loving someone who chooses everyone else over me, Elodie. I've spent my whole life being the person behind the camera, useful but never chosen. I won't do it again, not even for her." "Then tell her that," Elodie said, not in a drawing room full of people who've never once put her happiness above their own convenience. "Tell her yourself." I thought about that for a long time after Elodie left, sitting in my darkroom that evening, developing an old roll of film I'd forgotten I'd shot, photographs from that first engagement party, the ones I'd taken before any of this began. I found the image again, the one I'd almost missed, Seraphine watching me from across a room full of white roses and performed happiness, her eyes doing something no camera should have been able to catch, wanting, plainly and helplessly, to be seen. I understood, looking at that photograph in the red safe light of my darkroom, that Seraphine Arden had spent her entire life learning that wanting things was dangerous, that love had cost her a mother too young and a woman she'd loved and never learned to keep, that 15 years of protecting her family had taught her the only safe way to love someone was to give them up before they could be taken from her. I understood, and understanding didn't make the hurt disappear, but it made room for something else beside it. 3 days before the gala, I found Seraphine waiting outside my studio in the early evening, standing beneath the flickering street lamp with an umbrella she wasn't using despite the light drizzle, looking, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain of her welcome. "Elodie told me you were angry," she said, before I could decide whether to invite her in. "She didn't need to. I already knew." "You didn't defend me," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "You stood in that room and let your sister call me an opportunist. And you said nothing until it was time to end things. I know. She looked down at the umbrella in her hands like she'd forgotten she was holding it. May I come in? I'd rather not do this on the sidewalk, though I understand if you'd rather I did. I let her in, mostly because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still wanted to hear what she had to say, and she stood in the middle of my cluttered studio, the same room she'd once called alive, looking smaller than her reputation ever allowed her to look in public. I have spent 15 years believing that love is something you sacrifice for the people who depend on you, she said quietly. My mother died and left me a family that didn't know how to hold itself together, and I decided, very young, that the only way to keep everyone safe was to disappear behind duty. I buried a woman I loved once, because loving her felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, while Margot needed me, while the foundation needed me, while every scandal needed someone calm enough to manage it. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy in the dim studio light. When that photograph appeared, my first instinct wasn't to protect myself, Calla. It was to protect you. I told myself that stepping back, giving Margot what she wanted, would keep you from becoming a permanent target for a family that has destroyed better people than either of us for far smaller inconveniences. That's not protection, I said, my voice breaking despite my effort to keep it steady. That's just another version of hiding. You didn't ask me what I wanted. You decided for both of us. I know, she said again, and this time her voice cracked too. I've had 9 days to understand exactly how badly I failed you. I keep returning to something you told me, that first day in the gallery, about not deleting truth because it's inconvenient. I've spent this entire week trying to delete you because it was inconvenient to admit how much I needed you. And I am so sorry, Calla. I don't know how to be the kind of person who chooses love loudly. I've never had the chance to practice. I studied her for a long moment, this woman who commanded boardrooms and silenced skeptics with a single look, standing in my cramped studio with rain in her hair. Finally, fully undone, something in me wanted to simply forgive her, to fold back into the easy warmth we'd built together. But I made myself hold still instead. I need to show you something, I said finally, and led her back to my small dark room, the red safe light glowing warm against the walls, the smell of developing chemicals sharp and familiar. I pulled the strip of negatives from where I'd hung them to dry days earlier and clipped one onto the light table between us. It was the photograph from the very first night, the one I'd almost missed. Seraphine watching me across a room full of white roses, her expression naked with longing, before she'd learned I would ever see it. I've looked at this photograph almost every night since the gala, I admitted, trying to understand what I saw in you before either of us understood it ourselves. You looked like someone who'd forgotten she was allowed to want anything. I recognize that because I've spent my whole life the exact same way, useful behind a camera, but never chosen in front of one. I looked up at her, my throat tight. I don't want to be someone's inconvenient truth, Seraphine. I want to be chosen, plainly, in daylight, in front of people who might disapprove. I want what you told me you couldn't give the woman before me. Then let me give it to you, Seraphine said, stepping closer under the red glow of the safe light, her hand coming up to rest gently against my cheek. Not because I owe you a correction for what I did wrong, because I have spent 9 days discovering that a life without you in it isn't a safer life, Calla. It's simply an empty one, dressed up as duty so it hurts less to look at directly. That's not an apology, I said softly, though my resolve was already softening under the warmth of her hand. No, she agreed. It's a promise. Give me the chance to keep it in front of everyone, not just in a dark room where no one else can see. I studied her face in the dim red light, searching for the hesitation I'd seen in that drawing room, the careful retreat behind composure, and I found none of it. What I found instead was a woman who had spent an entire life learning to disappear, finally choosing, deliberately, to be seen. Okay, I whispered, and she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 9 days, and she kissed me slowly in the red glow of my dark room, careful and certain, surrounded by strips of drying negatives that held, among 100 other truths, the entire quiet story of how we'd found each other. The charity gala was 2 weeks later, the Arden Foundation's largest annual event, and I hadn't planned to attend. My contract had been quietly terminated, after all, replaced by an older, more established photographer who wouldn't embarrass anyone with an inconvenient headline. But Elodie sent me an invitation anyway, handwritten, tucked inside a small note that said only, "She'll be there." So should the truth. I went. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to the engagement party months earlier, and I walked into a ballroom filled with the same kind of performed happiness I'd photographed that first night. Except this time I came without a camera, without the safety of a lens between me and the room. I found Seraphine near the same kind of shadowed wall she'd occupied the first night we'd met, dressed in dark red silk instead of black. And when our eyes met across the crowded room, I watched something break open in her expression before she could smooth it back into composure. Margot found me before Seraphine could, her voice pitched just loud enough to draw attention from the surrounding guests. "I believe I made myself clear, Miss Mercer. Your presence here isn't welcome." "I wasn't invited by you," I said, holding my ground despite the eyes now turning toward us, despite Julian appearing at Margot's shoulder with a look of cold satisfaction. "And I'm not leaving until I've said what I came to say." "This is not the venue for a scene," Margot hissed. "No," Seraphine said, her voice cutting through the gathering crowd, calm and clear and carrying, and I turned to find her walking toward us, her chin lifted, every carefully built wall in her posture suddenly, deliberately, coming down. "But it's precisely the venue for the truth, since we've spent this entire family's history hiding from it." The room had gone quiet around us, dozens of wealthy, curious faces turning toward the unfolding scene, and Seraphine didn't flinch from any of it. "Seraphine," Margot warned. "No, Margot. I'm finished absorbing everyone's damage, so the rest of this family can pretend it doesn't exist." Seraphine's eyes found mine, steady now, certain in a way I hadn't seen from her since that first drawing room confrontation. I love this woman. I loved her before I understood how dangerous that would be to admit, and I let this family convince me that protecting her meant giving her up. I was wrong. Protecting someone you love means standing beside them, not hiding them away like a liability. "You'll destroy everything this family has built," Margot said, her voice tight with fury. "This family was built on obedience and silence," Seraphine said. "I helped build it that way. I'm done." She turned to Julian next, her voice sharpening. "And you'll stop pretending my niece's unhappiness is a private matter, when half this room has watched you control her for the better part of a year." "Aunt Seraphine," Elodie started, but Seraphine shook her head gently. "You don't have to marry a man who values your family's name more than your happiness, Elodie. You never did. I should have told you that a long time ago, instead of letting your mother convince us both that love was a luxury we couldn't afford." Elodie's eyes filled with tears, and beside her, Julian's composure finally cracked, his face flushing with humiliation as the room's attention shifted fully onto him, onto the quiet, controlling cruelty that had been hiding beneath his polished exterior for months. "I don't want this," Elodie said, quiet but clear, pulling the engagement ring from her finger, with hands that shook only slightly. "I haven't wanted this for a long time. I'm sorry, Julian. I can't keep pretending anymore." The room around us buzzed with scandal, with whispered speculation, with the particular electric hum of wealthy people watching a story unfold that they'd be repeating for months. But I barely heard any of it, because Seraphine had crossed the remaining distance between us and taken both of my hands in hers, her eyes searching my face with something that looked almost like fear. "I'm sorry," she said, quiet enough that it was only for me. "I let 15 years of protecting everyone else convince me that loving you would be a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, Calla. You were the first true thing I'd let myself see in years, and I threw it away because I was terrified of what it might cost me." "It cost me too," I said, my voice unsteady. "I spent my whole life being the person who was useful but never chosen. When you chose your family's comfort over me, it confirmed everything I'd always been afraid was true. I choose you," she said, immediate and certain, her hands tightening around mine. "I should have said it in that drawing room. I'm saying it now, in front of everyone who ever taught me that love had to be hidden to be safe. I choose you, Calla Mercer. Not quietly, not carefully. I don't want to hide this, or you, or myself, ever again." I looked at her, at the raw honesty in her expression, at the woman who'd spent 15 years learning to disappear behind duty and had just, in front of everyone who mattered to her reputation, chosen to be seen instead. And something in me that had been braced for another disappointment finally allowed itself to believe her. "Okay," I said softly, and she let out a breath that sounded like relief and laughter both. And she kissed me then, right there in the middle of the Arden Foundation's most prestigious gala, in front of gossip columnists and board members and Margot's furious, helpless silence. And I kissed her back without a single thought for who might be watching. Because for the first time in my life, being watched didn't feel like a threat. It felt like being known. The scandal, as scandals tend to do among the wealthy, burned hot for a few weeks and then began to cool, though not in the direction Margot had hoped. The story that spread wasn't one of an opportunistic photographer seducing her way into a fortune. It was the story of a powerful, guarded woman finally choosing honesty over appearances, of a bride who'd found the courage to walk away from a marriage built on obligation, of a family finally cracking open enough to let some real air inside. My studio, once teetering on the edge of closing its doors, found itself flooded with new clients, drawn by the same honest, unguarded style of photography that had first caught Seraphine's attention, people who didn't want performed happiness in their portraits anymore, who wanted, instead, to be truly seen. Elodie moved into a small apartment across town, enrolled in an art history program she'd wanted to study for years before her mother had steered her toward a marriage instead, and she came by my studio some afternoons just to talk. Easier now, lighter, like a person slowly remembering who she might have been all along. Margot remained distant, cold in the way she'd always been cold, though even she, in time, stopped trying to actively undo what her sister had built. Seraphine and I took things slowly, deliberately, the way two people build something meant to last rather than something meant to burn bright and fast. She came to my studio some evenings after the foundation closed, helping me organize prints, learning the particular chaos of a working photographer's space. And I went to her townhouse some nights, learning the particular quiet of a life she was slowly, carefully, allowing herself to enjoy, rather than simply manage. 6 months after the gala, I opened my first solo gallery exhibition, in a small space not far from the Arden Foundation, a collection of unposed portraits I'd been quietly building for years. Real smiles, real grief, real love. All the moments people usually tried to hide from a camera lens. I titled it What the Light Finds, and the weeks leading up to opening night felt like the busiest and most joyful of my entire career. Curating frame after frame with Ren's help, choosing which fragments of truth deserved a wall of their own. On opening night, the small gallery filled with more people than I'd ever dared hope for. Old wedding clients who'd become something like friends over the years, Ren proudly telling anyone who'd listen that she'd discovered my talent years ago and had the receipts to prove it. Elodie beaming from a corner with a glass of wine, and a boyfriend from her art history program who looked at her like she'd invented sunlight, and near the entrance, dressed simply, without any of the armor she used to wear like a second skin, Seraphine. She moved through the gallery slowly, studying each photograph, and I watched her from across the room, the way I'd watched her from across another room, months earlier, except this time there was no fear in it, no careful distance, only the easy warmth of a woman who no longer needed to hide what she felt. Margot had not come, which surprised no one, though she had, in her own careful way, stopped actively working against her sister's happiness, a small mercy that Seraphine treated as something close to a miracle. Seraphine stopped in front of one particular photograph near the center of the exhibit, the one I'd taken of her in that first portrait session, the unguarded breath I'd caught before either of us had understood what it meant, and beside it, a second photograph, taken more recently, of her laughing, truly laughing, her head tipped back, unposed and entirely real. "You kept this," she said quietly, when I came to stand beside her. "I kept both," I said. "The beginning and what came after. That felt important." She looked at me then, the same searching look she'd given me in her townhouse the night everything between us had changed, and she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, battered camera, an old film camera, secondhand, clearly not her usual pristine taste in objects. "I bought this last week," she said, a little sheepish, an expression I'd never once seen on her face before we met. I thought perhaps it was time I learned to see things myself, instead of only through you. "You want me to teach you photography?" "I want," she said, taking my hand, lacing her fingers through mine in front of the entire room, in front of anyone who cared to notice, to stop being someone who only exists behind glass, or reputation, or duty. "I want us both, for once, to be inside the frame." I laughed, something warm and full blooming in my chest, and I took the camera from her hands, checking the settings out of habit, an old reflex from years of teaching amateurs how to properly hold a lens steady, and then I turned toward a passing gallery assistant and asked, simply, if she'd mind taking a photograph of the two of us. Seraphine's arm slid around my waist, easy and certain, and I leaned into her, into the solid warmth of her, into the particular, hard-won miracle of being chosen instead of merely useful, and when the shutter clicked, I didn't need to see the image to know exactly what it would show. Two women who had spent their whole lives believing love required hiding, finally standing together in the light, unguarded, unafraid, and entirely, wonderfully seen. Later that night, after the gallery had emptied and the last of the wine had been poured out, Seraphine and I stood together in the quiet space, surrounded by walls of honest photographs, her new camera resting between us on a low table. "Teach me something," she said, "tonight, right now." "It's dark," I pointed out, laughing. "You need light for a photograph." "Then teach me to find it," she said, and there was nothing metaphorical in the way she said it, and everything metaphorical in it at once, and I laughed again, pulling her toward the gallery's front window, where the city lights spilled gold and amber through the glass, and I showed her how to hold the old camera steady, how to breathe out slowly before the shutter clicked, how to wait, patiently, for the moment that was true rather than simply convenient. She photographed the skyline first, a little unsteady, laughing at her own mistakes in a way the old Seraphine never would have allowed herself. Then she turned the camera toward me, and I let her, standing still in the low gallery light with my whole heart plainly visible on my face, no longer the woman who hid behind the lens because being chosen felt too dangerous to hope for. "There," I said softly, when she lowered the camera. "That's how you find the light. You just have to be brave enough to point it somewhere real." "I think," Seraphine said, setting the camera down and pulling me close, resting her forehead against mine, the way she had that very first night in her townhouse, "I have finally found something worth being brave for." Outside the gallery window, the city hummed on, indifferent and enormous, and inside, in the quiet golden light, two women who had each spent a lifetime believing love was a danger to be managed, instead let themselves simply stay, no longer hiding, no longer performing, no longer waiting behind a lens for a happiness that belonged to someone else. It was theirs now, plainly, imperfectly, entirely theirs, and neither of us had any intention of ever looking away again.